and Native Americans is very difficult to find out about and to compare to. African ancestry is a lot easier because that was the first population that these testing companies went into. And what they did is they went into an indigenous population, so a population in Africa that's been there thousands of years. So it's the same population that was living there before they left Africa, okay? That's what they call an indigenous population, and they're still living there. They're still maintaining their cultures. And they said, we will give you money for water or food or infrastructure. In return, you will let us DNA test your children in school. Okay? So that's how they built that reference population that I mentioned. So in African ancestry relies on DNA testing quite a bit because they have fewer records, right? Because of slavery and because of record loss and because of not having a surname. Like, we've had surnames in the past 600 years. They've only had surnames in the past 200 years. Okay, so yeah. Adoptees are also heavily relying on DNA testing right now.
You get a different breakdown. Yours was 1% and then 99%. You're 99% European. If an African American is tested, are you likely to find quite a different background? It's not going to be 99% African.
Well, that's kind of interesting. So the question is what's, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, what's the average percent for an African American who gets tested? And nowadays, the average percent for African American is about 80% African American, 20% European. However, that's going down. So the more people who get tested, the more we're seeing it shifting to more of a 40-60%. So 40% European, 60% African American. Yes?
Real quick, I'm in correspondence with a man called Terry, and we are a very good match. He is African American. I am not. And we were able to find a Mennonite ancestor,
Yes.
not an ancestor of mine, but related to the same people I am in Pennsylvania, and this guy left and went down to Alabama.
Okay, yeah.
And we can't get it any closer than Mr. Singley, who was singular out of Germany, but Terry and I have had a good time with him.
Yeah, yeah. And when I first saw the Africans show up in my test, and granted, I've been tested with 2 companies, and it only showed up in 1 company, I was a little surprised. But then when I went and I looked at my grandmother's profile, she has African American in her profile as well, and so does my father. So I know that the African American came through my father and through his mother. And my grandmother is a lot fairer skinned than I am. I mean, she's the one with the 60% Scandinavian. So you can tell, it's kind of fun. You can tell just by looking at the science behind it and the percent predictions. So.
How much accuracy can you get when, say, you are the only one still living? I mean, your parents are deceased, your siblings are deceased. How much accuracy do you get out of that?
Out of the ethnicity prediction or the test in general?
The testing in general.
I mean, your DNA is your DNA. That's never going to change whether your parents are living or deceased. I'm one of the 5% that's lucky that has parents that got tested. Most people getting tested don't have parents, living parents. So the norm is that most people are just testing themselves, or they're testing. It's actually better to test first and second cousins, because for 2 reasons. 1, you want that little bit of diversity, and 2, you kind of want to go back to the older generations. So if maybe your parents aren't living, but your aunt is living, test that older generation. Because remember I told you the test only goes back to 5 generations. Well, the further back you test, the further back you can go with the test. So Yeah, it's very common for people to test their cousins. Yes?
I have a question about DNA testing on cremation remains. Is that, read some, that at one point that wasn't plausible, but now through the teeth not being totally destroyed, that there is still possibility that DNA can be extracted from ashes, DNA from ashes? Is that?
I mean, you can ask the testing company if they're interested in following that lead. It's really up to the testing company. It never hurts to ask them.
I was going, all right, haplotype and haplogroup.
Okay?
What's the difference?
So the haplogroup is for Y DNA testing and mitochondrial DNA testing. That is your ancient origins.
Right.
So that is like a assignment to your migration group. So if you left point A and you went to point B, then you are a certain haplogroup. And that's where you ended up. There's about, I think, 7 or 8 haplogroups for the Y DNA, and there's 4 or 5 for the mitochondrial DNA. Haplotype is just your specific DNA. Yeah. So it's every single one of those markers and the values that they represent.
Give us some feel for the cost of these matches.
Okay, so the Y DNA testing is expensive. So again, you want to have a specific goal in mind when you take a Y DNA test.
Expensive.
Probably a minimum of $150 just to get started. Yeah.
And that would just be for men anyway.
Yeah, that's for men. Mitochondrial DNA testing. There's 3 kinds of tests you can take. There's a cheap test, another cheap test,
Oh, yeah.
and then
Yeah.
the full cost test. Mitochondrial DNA testing is only valuable if you take the full amount, the highest price test. Because the first 2 tests are useless. Don't even bother taking them. If
Take
you,
all 3
no,
tests, what would be the cost?
if you take all 3 of which test?
The type test?
Non-contact.
Mitochondrial, yeah.
$199.
I think he's talking about the Y, the
Mitochondrial and the autosomal. Oh, I
and the
see.
autosomal.
Okay.
Well, sometimes they have bundle prices, but I would say you'd spend about $300 total.
Mm.
Yeah, for yourself, one person.
Well, when you talk about the full mitochondrial test, how do you know that you're getting can you just do the full and not the other 2 cheap
Yeah,
ones?
yeah, yeah. The full
And how do you know
includes,
that you're getting the full?
the full includes the first 2 inexpensive ones.
I see.
So the
it's all
first
packaged.
test is an HBR1, the second test is an HBR2, and the third test is called FMS. It's full mitochondrial sequence.
I see.
That's the one that contains all the good stuff.
Okay.
And that's probably $199, I think. Yeah.
Unless they have a sale.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And then the
I was gonna
autosomal.
say, you just keep watching, and, you know,
Yeah.
'cause every once in a while, they'll drop it 20, $30.
And the autosomal test is $99.
And that's
unless it's on
$99.
sale.
But you can transfer it from Ancestry DNA for $39.
Yeah, so,
You said the autosomal was 99, right?
where did my slide go? Autosomal is 99, yeah. And so what you can do is, there's 3 testing companies, and they're on your handout.
Right.
And if you test through Ancestry, this is my recommendation. You test through Ancestry, which is on sale right now for $69.
See, they just dropped another.
We should have
Which
waited.
one is 69?
Ancestry
But I mean, which test is 69?
is only one test. And so, that's another good question. Ancestry.com
Yeah.
only sells one test. That's the autosomal test.
Ah, the autosomal.
23andMe also only sells one test. That's the autosomal test. Family Tree DNA is the only testing company that sells Y-DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and autosomal.
And SNPs and
Now-
special stuff and.
Do you know, excuse me,
Yes.
do you know if the National Geographic test you can still transfer those results
Yes.
to FTDNA?
Yes.
Because that's how I got my first one, was I did the
the Y DNA, and that was
They,
a number of years ago.
Apart from most of those DNA tests, yeah, tell me something. In terms of, say, the church, is it, do you find that the church is very helpful in bringing out some of these information, especially in terms of the family tree? But I have found that the church is most helpful in helping anyone, and it's very cheap, you know. What's your opinion on it?
which church are you talking about?
I'm talking about church in general. I'm saying that I have found that we can get a lot of information through churches, and I'm talking
Oh,
about.
yeah, okay. I understand what you mean,
Mhm.
yeah. So you mean with
Regard to family tree
and records?
and records.
Okay, yeah, church is definitely a valuable resource and one that's not used as much as it should be used. Generally, if you find information about a church online and you find that your ancestor was affiliated with a church, it's very easy to give them a call. And a lot of churches have archives. And if they don't have archives, then generally the university in the area will have the archives for that church. So you can get a lot of valuable records from them.
One more. Look, when you talk about ethnicity and the different types of tests, what kind of variation do you get on ethnicity? Are you, I mean, is it 10%, or can you get an average based on, say, three or four different tests?
Yeah, you would probably get an average. So again, this goes back to the reference population that company uses. So right now, 23andMe has decided that they want to build up their African American database. So A, they're giving away a ton of tests for free to African Americans in the United States. And B, they are one of those groups that are going into the indigenous populations in Africa and testing the school children and building their database of that. They also will pick other populations that are of interest to them. So family tree DNA, National Geographic is the one that also did a lot of the African testing as
They're the
well.
ones that really started the whole thing.
Yes, so the companies use their model where they go in, they give them something, and then they get something in return, and it benefits both populations. Now, the Native American population, you know, they fought so hard to get these rights, and they, you know, want to be accepted in the government as a community, but at the same time, they don't want the government to control them. So they're kind of afraid. They're sort of like, oh, we're Native American, but no, don't prove it. So don't put it on paper. So the Native Americans right now, I mean, there's communities in the Midwest who don't have water. I mean, these testing companies are trying to go in there and say, hey, we can build you a potable water. You know, why not just, you know, give us a little bit of your samples?
But as everybody keeps doing a DNA test and the database grows and grows, I mean, 20 years down the road or 30 years down the road, I mean, we could get to some real specifics.
Yeah.
I mean,
Absolutely.
I mean,
And in fact, a new company just opened up, and it's called DNA Land, DNA.land. And it's a citizen science project. It's run by a scientific organization at, I think it's Columbia University in New York City. And you can put your DNA, you can upload it just like you would gedmatch.com if you've done that. You can upload it to DNA.land, and they will find matches for you and give that back to you. But they also use your DNA for scientific research. So
you think they'll ever put people like me out of business? So I'm thinking 20 or 30 years down the road.
You have to have a tree and do your
And-
homework.
Oh, yeah.
first.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
yeah.
gotta look through the church records, that's the.
yeah, yes ma'am.
All right, you talk a lot about DNA. What happens on your end as far as the DNA test itself? You know, how reliable is it? What procedures do you go through when you do a DNA testing? You know,
Yeah, so,
What happens on that end?
so when you order your kit from the company, they send it to you in the mail, and it's in a sealed package, and you break it open. And again, so Family Tree DNA has the cheek swab. So it's just a little, it's like a Q-tip, you put it in your mouth and you do this, and then you stick it in a test tube, you break it off, and then you seal it and you put it back in the mail. And usually you do maybe 2 or 3 tubes. I took my test a long time ago, so I don't know what they're doing now.
Two, first thing in the
tubes.
morning, before you drink anything and before you brush your teeth.
Yeah, yeah. So if you are testing like an older relative who has a hard time with the spit, the DNA cheek swab is the way to go. Now 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, they are spit kits, and I never thought I had a problem making saliva, but when I went to take my test, I had to go chew a stick of bubble gum because I couldn't fill the tube. So these are just they're little things you have to consider. But, yeah.
Is that the only 2 ways that you can test your DNA?
Yes. Yes. It's cells. Yeah, it's not a blood test or anything. It's
If
just-
somebody has died, you can't dig them up and test their DNA.
I mean, that's again the same question she asked.
Yeah.
You're certainly welcome to contact the company and ask them if they're interested in helping you out with if it's a hair sample or
Yeah.
cremated remains.
How about you? How about us contacting you? Do you have, a website or you free,
Yes.
do you offer free advice?
Yes, yes. I mean, I can do all that. You can give me a call, and my website and my email address is on your handout. It's very easy. It's called yourdnadiva.com.
Money?
If you want to give me money, sure. Yeah.
So you said these here are saliva, and what was the other thing they take?
Cheek swab.
And just
Cheek swab.
basic
Yeah.
cells from your skin there. Okay.
Yes,
And
they're
that's
both
it.
cellular.
That's
yeah.
all they use.
And so then,
The saliva
yeah,
and the-
so you would do that, and then you want to package it back up right away. You don't want to sit it out so that your cat can come and paw at it and play with it on the floor.
Right.
It goes to the contamination. And are there mix-ups at the lab? Absolutely.
Sure.
Yes, there are, but you're going to know that.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you get a surprise in your DNA results, if you find out you have another mother,
That's,
please call them before you get upset. Just make a phone call and say, can you double check this? I'm pretty sure I know who my mom is, or my dad, maybe less so with the dad, but no, just kidding.
If you got a hair sample from somebody that's dead years ago, can you have that tested to find the DNA?
Well, so the question is, can you test a hair sample that you collected many years ago? So this falls into the category of contamination. How many people's hands have that passed through? I mean, if you were forensic scientists when you collected it and you had gloves on when you took the sample and you immediately stuck it in a plastic bag and you sealed it and you taped it, then yeah, they probably could do something with that. But if you didn't have gloves on, you just pulled it out with your hands,
This was half.
stuck it in your pocket.
sample.
Yeah, yeah. And and one of those things is, if somebody did stick it somewhere like a Bible, how many times do you pull that out and look at it, or you show it to your granddaughter or your sister? It comes out. It really does. And it can get contaminants from, touching the Bible,
Does
your
that mean you
fingerprints.
think some of your cells from your fingers are gonna be also,
Yeah.
they'll tell you that it's you instead of somebody else?
Yeah, yeah. You'd be amazed at how many different samples you would end up on that. So, now if you had the hairbrush intact and it's been in a box, then possibly you can take that hairbrush and find a sample. Let the lab do it. So send them the whole brush. Same thing with,
But that would be a lot more
Do that.
expensive than these tests that they sell.
oh yes,
then
Oh,
these.
Because
Yeah.
yes.
what they do is, is one particular test and one method of converting it to the material that they use.
Yeah,
And,
Yeah.
you know, they're streamlined to do it that way. To do these other things we see on television all the time would be a lot more expensive to do.
So feel free to visit the website or email me. I'm happy to answer questions or call me.
And she does answer the phone.
That's-